All right, CJ, we've got to muster up some energy here to address the second installment of this Nietzsche discussion for the podcast. All right. Earlier today, I had a chance to review the tape from last week and what we did there. And I think we really effectively addressed the contours of the Apollonian and the Dionysian and how these things sort of may interact with one another. And we talked about possibly there being an aesthetic justification for life itself and how the Apollonian may sort of protect the individual and allow him to affirm his life in some way. But we also played around with this nebulous idea that there may be a metaphysical plan or schema acting itself out in the individualistic art impulses that then sort of get magnified to the culture at large. But something that I think we need to address tonight, and I'm going to, jog your memory as much as possible with this, because I know it's also there. I know you wanted to sort of jump into a discussion of sort of scientism and Socratism and things like that, but we have this middle ground that we have to cover. And that is the discussion of the emergence of the particular art form that is Greek tragedy. Mm-hmm. So before we can sort of jump ahead to how Greek tragedy died, right, and why it is no longer a popular art form, why it's not so commonly practiced, we need to talk about how it became a popular art form in the first place. So I'm going to restrain myself a little bit, and I'm going to see, what do you remember Nietzsche saying about how Greek tragedy got to be so popular? Where did it start? Mm-hmm. Did it all arrive at once? Was it incrementally built upon? What does it do? Why did it become so popular? Is it addressing something? Mm-hmm. Why was it so radical?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think bringing up the two different forms that we have, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, I think Greek tragedy at least is unique in that it combines both of those together in a way, which is kind of, whoa, that's crazy, because we thought these two were total opposites, but they're actually, when you combine the two, they form this weird kind of jambalaya of art and life. I don't really know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just forms this unique form of art, which we called Greek tragedy.
Right. So we talked about, in our last discussion, we gave instances of the Apollonian art tendency mm-hmm. and the Dionysian art tendency. We said the Apollonian art tendency was typically characterized by plastic art images, drawing, painting, sculpture. And we said that the Dionysian was characterized by things that were intoxicating, such as music. Is there all that we have to say is, oh, well, Greek tragedy, it's got both. Yeah. That makes it superior to the just plain Apollonian Dionysian. End of story. Let's move on to talk about why it died.
Right. Yeah.
It's not that simple.
No.
Because what's going to be super fascinating and talking about this synthesis of the Apollonian and the Dionysian is not so much the fact that they dwell together, but how they respond to one another and how they got to dwell together.
Yeah.
So I think
we gotta try to talk about
you got to do that, because it's not just like there was.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like it was just like this Greek playwright was just said, "Hey, let's take some dream images and let's take some music and just like, I like peanut butter and I like jelly. Let's just make something really good." It's more complicated than that, right?
Right.
So. And maybe this touches on something that we were at odds at last time, because you and I got into a conversation about which came first, mm-hmm. the Dionysian or the Apollonian. Now, I have a hunch that it's the Dionysian, because the Dionysian seems to be more primordial,
right,
and the Apollonian seems to be a response to it. And maybe our discussion of Greek tragedy will illustrate this and maybe answer it to some degree. I don't know. Probably not, but we'll give it a try anyway. So what do you recall about, do you remember what he says happens first in the development of Greek tragedy?
As in like how it's made?
Yeah, like how does it come to be? Does a playwright just sort of like get lost in this sort of dream world and sort of develop a tragic hero and a cast, and then it's like, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if they all like sang and danced together? Or does it emerge a different way?
I remember he had a really interesting moment where he was talking about the lyric poet, and maybe this is
totally it.
Yeah,
keep
where
going.
He talks about this idea that, okay, how can this lyric poet to him is so interesting because it involves both the Dionysian and the Apollonian, but it's so odd because the Dionysian is not this subjective thing, which the lyric poet's always saying, I did this, I went here, I did this, I did that, I lost my love, and that is very not Dionysian at all, because when we think of the Dionysian, we think of breaking down the veils of subjectivity and of individuality and of just this miasma of will and whatnot. So what I recall is that Nietzsche said, okay, so we start with this kind of singular person, but what he's doing is that he's bringing to himself the will in some way. He's calling upon the will, and then from there he takes that will and then he refracts that. I don't even know if that's the right word, like refracting mirror. I don't even know if that's the right word. Let's say that's the right
I know
word.
what you're saying. And
it kind of distorts. Then he distorts it through a mirror of the Apollonian, which creates another image in itself. But that image isn't necessarily Apollonian because it still has the Dionysian in it. So it's so fascinating because even though he is saying I, it's not really I because it's the Dionysian, or at least he's pulling from.
Right. So the lyric poet is going to be, help us try to understand how the elements of the Greek tragedy come together. And I think you're largely right. And if I could just clarify a few things, is that the way he takes a cue from Schiller, trying to understand how lyric poets come to be, and we should distinguish between what a lyric poet is and like what a Homeric poet is. Mm-hmm. The epic poetry is sort of totally lost in sort of dream images and myths and things like that. Whereas the lyric poet, he thinks of the lyric poet as sort of first conceiving of like a musical mood, right? He's sort of like getting into a mind space where he's just like tapping into something melodious. Like I've never tried to compose poetry or write lyrics, songs, music, or something like that, or anything like that. But it makes sense in a way. And then like the lyric poet is sort of, he's not so Apollonian that he goes over and does things that Homer does, but he has sort of access to that realm a little bit. He can steal some images and things like that to give voice to this fulminating Dionysian that's within him. And so like you indicated, the lyric poet is saying I, which would be very counterintuitive because the lyric poet is still kind of in the Dionysian. If he says I, he says he would be individuated, would be part of the Apollonian. But Nietzsche says that this I is really going to be this eternal essence channeling through the lyric poet as sort of a medium, right? So like when the lyric poet goes like, I long for peace or to be free from this or something like that. It's really going to be sort of the Dionysian being given voice through the lyric poet.
Right, and then we think like, oh, is it diluted then? But I mean, that's the interesting thing about tragedy. Is it almost like is it a dilution of the Apollonian or the Dionysian, or is it just this weird kind of mix where both of them are going at full? Because it would seem like you're saying that he's not so much channeled into the Apollonian, so he's not entirely lost in the dream images, and yet he's not entirely lost in the Dionysian, or else he would be obliterated. So he's kind of in this weird middle ground, which I guess is what makes Greek tragedy so fascinating, is that you're not necessarily in each all the way, you're kind of taking a little bit from each. I don't know, you're on this like, I almost imagine like you're on a tightrope between both.
He has lots of metaphors to describe this. He'll talk about a boat that's like battered around in the ocean.
Yeah, I think that's a Schopenhauer.
Yeah. So there are lots of different nice metaphors that he has for this. But I think this sort of sets the stage for us trying to understand how Greek tragedy came about. Is like by looking at sort of how the lyric poet sort of emerges from this melodious musical place to kind of assert the Dionysian through sort of the spare sort of Apollonian images that it has available to it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of he's going to allow us to get our foot in to understand how this comes about. And he looks back at sort of the evolution of Greek tragedy, and I don't know if you remember what he says comes first.
I can't remember.
Well, if we think the analog is that if the music comes first for the lyric poet, so that he can generate these sort of like these Prometheus sort of like stealings from the Apollonian realm, that he's going to say that the Greek satyr chorus is going to come first, right? Like this is going to be sort of the representation of the Dionysian will.
I think that's something interesting to note, is that for him, I mean, if we're talking, I think we talked about earlier about a hierarchy, how he kind of sets a hierarchy of the arts, and it seems that music, at least for him, is cream of the crop, the top of the heap, because because poetry is just trying to, like you said, the lyric, he's trying to imitate music, but he can't really get at he can't get at the essence that music is portraying in the Dionysian, but he's doing a favor by mimicking what really gets to that.
Well, he says that the lyric poet is like, by employing language, is necessarily going to be a couple steps removed from music, right? So music's going to be the most immediate manifestation of the Dionysian will, but then so the lyric poet is going to be dealing with images or appearances that are like really not existent. Those are illusions, right? They're not ultimately going to be individuated. So that's one step away from this unified will. And then language is going to be a manifestation, an appearance of appearance, or a symbolization of phenomenon. So words will be employed in sort of a musical fashion to blend with the music, but they're really kind of two tiers away. And now the Apollonian poet is going to be way far away from the Dionysian, because he's like all caught up in representation. But what's interesting is if the lyric poet is sort of like going off of music to generate his lyrics to begin with or whatever, we would sort of suspect that the satyr chorus, as being a manifestation of the Dionysian will, would come first as well. So then the question then becomes, well, let's talk a little bit about, I want to say this, you talk about this hierarchy, that music is going to, in a way, be pure, but we have to also say the music is going to be lower, in a sense, on this hierarchy too, because it's closer to that which is primordial. So it's like, in some ways it may seem to Nietzsche the best, but it's also going to be the closest to the original thing that's animating everything.
Again, that's our theme of just this weird kind of, we're in the middle of everything. It's also up, it's also down. It's, this weird... Yeah, I mean, again, that just kind of touches on that. Yeah.
So we kind of understand the tension between how the lyric poet is sort of this transitional figure, right? How they're a generation of the Dionysian, but they have access to some Apollonian stuff to make it blend in with the music. Now, so we translate that over into the evolution of Greek tragedy, right? And so if we have this satyr chorus, that's sort of, we have to kind of ask ourselves, what is this satyr chorus doing?
Right.
So we're saying it's going to come first, but before we can talk about what it's going to do next, maybe we should say something about what its function is in a theatrical setting.
And at least to me, it seems like it's just trying to pull everybody in, trying to eliminate the outer world and bring everybody into the setting. Because I know Nietzsche, if I remember about this part, he talks about the idea that the ideal listener would be so enthralled in this chorus or in this thing that maybe if he saw something bad happen to one of the characters, he would rush up and tackle the bad guy or something like that. But I think what he's trying to say is that a chorus, at least, is trying to get you involved. It's trying to reel you in, and it's kind of like, shut up, hey, look what's happening, and then to convince you that what's happening, at least for now, is real, or at least that it is this essence of tragedy, which is it's Dionysian. It's also Dionysian, also Apollonian, and that you can't really tell where you are exactly because you're just involved in images and involved in this intoxication. And
right, I was gonna say you're largely hit on it. The only thing I would add to it, as far as how it achieves this effect of individuals surrendering their identity to the Dionysian Greek chorus or whatever, is that the very construction of the Greek theaters or whatever sort of limited its, people would walk in from work or wherever else in their daily lives or whatever, but they would sort of get caught up in this Seder chorus, and like they would be sort of sublimated into the oneness of this entire thing. So that we can talk about what it does to the spectators, but also we can talk about like what it's setting the stage for. And ultimately it's going to be kind of quartering off a poetical space for a projection. Right? And I think that's probably where the analog with the lyric poet comes, right? So the question is, the interesting question becomes is like, why didn't Greek tragedy just remain chorus? Right? This is a really fascinating question. Why couldn't it have just stayed chorus? Wouldn't it have been great? Like, we all come in from our jobs, we think we're important, we engage in a little bit of chorus, we're exposed to the abyss, and we walk out and we get sort of our taste of the Dionysian truth that there is no principle of individuation, there is no self, and that everything is sort of unified, and stare into that abyss. But it doesn't stop there for some reason. For some reason, and then this is where the Apollinian compliment comes in, right? And the Apollinian compliment doesn't happen all at once. There's a first sort of burst or discharge from that Dionysian representation in the Greek chorus. And do you recall what that first burst is? And then maybe we can talk about why that discharge and burst happens.
Well, I'm going to segue back and maybe avoid the question. No, but I think that's very interesting that you mentioned how, okay, why shouldn't we just have the chorus? And I have to go back to that Nietzsche quote. I can't remember where it's from or what he said, but the idea that art is supposed to protect you from the truth, where it's just like, okay, so then maybe it's the Apollinian that's kind of protecting us from the Dionysian in this weird way, where it's like you can have both, but the Apollinian's almost like a protection from this. And I don't know if that goes into maybe where the burst started. I have no idea, but I thought that was an interesting point.
It changes because I think this is a hard part to understand with Nietzsche, because it's like, well, which point of view, right? So if we're looking at the person who's composing the play, do they have to, if we look at it from their perspective, do they have to have this Apollinian burst into the poetical space that the chorus has surrounded in order to preserve their sanity, right? So they can create distance between them and the Dionysian and sort of preserve themselves. Or do we look at it from a larger perspective where the Dionysian is going to sort of, it has to discharge here in this way? Or do we look at it from the spectator's perspective where they have to discharge in a certain way? Like, this is the thing that's, I don't want to say it's problematic about Nietzsche's account, but difficult about Nietzsche's account, because it's hard to know who is the ultimate subject in this play of the Apollinian Dionysian tendencies. Is it the author? Is it the spectator? Is it the will? Is it nature? And perhaps this is a larger critique we'd want to that you could level against it, because you don't know. It seems like the person is changing and growing and expanding whenever we talk about this.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing about the art. It almost reminds me of Eugene ONeill's A Long Day's Journey into Night, I think, his play, where it's very much autobiographical. It is autobiographical, and I remember reading about how he would be writing it, and his wife recalled that he just crying and just going, I mean, not going insane, but just in grief, because, I mean, this moment in his life that he was trying to depict in the play was really tragic. That his mother was addicted to drugs, and his father was a alcoholic who wanted to be in the theater. He was great, and then he just kind of washed out, and his brother's really a sick man, and it's just all these things are going around, and he's trying to depict it in this play. And of course he gives them pseudonyms, which maybe is like the Apollinian distance, but again, it still doesn't help, or still doesn't prevent him from looking into the, I guess you're saying, looking into the abyss, or looking in the Dionysian. So even though he does have a little distance, and I'm sure he's not saying word for word or what exactly is happening, there's still this clash of looking into the abyss and seeing how terrible this moment was in his life. So it's interesting because then, I mean, remember reading it, I guess, for school, and I was saying like, wow, Eugene ONeill, at least the writer, not so much the character, is the main character here. It's almost like he's a Dante going into his own inferno to, I guess like I can't remember in an inferno where you have to go all the way down to go out into paradise. So it's like he almost had to just delve deep into his soul to get this thing, which maybe it's like we gotta like delve deep into the Dionysian to get the Apollonian, and whether that means the writer, the spectator, whoever else is there, the bellhop, I don't know who else is there, but
let's we could talk about it from different perspectives. We could talk about it from the writer's perspective, and it makes a lot of sense if we say that the writer of Greek tragedy has stared into this abyss, and to heal himself, he's got to come up with this sort of Apollonian complement, right? And Nietzsche has this sort of, I like the metaphor that he uses. He talks about it being like inversely, like how we stare at the sun. Like if we stare at the sun and we look away, then we see like black spots. And he talks about if we stare into the abyss, we turn away and we see bright Apollonian images. As sort of like, they sort of naturally sort of generate themselves by staring into this. So like maybe the author is sort of experiencing Apollonian images as a result of being so preoccupied with the Dionysian.
So then when we stare into these Apollonian images, when we look away, then do we then see the abyss? Or do we see the black spots?
I think we're going to get there.
Okay, I was just asking.
I think the answer is yes.
Right, which is what?
Because tragedy has an arc.
Right.
And we're going to talk about that arc here in a second. And I think what we're trying to say here too is that for some reason the Dionysian being represented by music is not enough. Right? Like, so the god Dionysus is sort of represented by this encircled chorus or whatever, but his presence has not really been made known yet. So I think there's got to be this combination of like turning away from the abyss, but I think there also has to be this sort of drive within the chorus, the audience, the writer or whatever, that the god has to be given a voice. Like people want to hear this god. It's this looming presence in the room. It's like just this.
The elephant in the room.
Yeah, it's just this. Like I don't know how I don't know how else to represent it. Like if you feel like that, that's kind of what the Dionysian abyss to me would sound like, this like Penderecki like chorus of like dying voices or being swallowed up by God. So I think there's maybe some incentive to turn away from that abyss and have some Apollonian images and do what the lyric poet has done, but on a larger scale, try to give the Dionysian lyrical expression, right? Now, is this satisfactory? I don't know. Is this a satisfactory explanation? I don't know. Nietzsche's a weird kind of philosopher. We're not doing arguments here, right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
And I don't know how much. Outside of this, I don't really think about Greek tragedy a lot, so I don't really have an alternative explanation. Maybe I'll study some Aristotle here and do the Poetics at some point, but that Dionysian, as a result of the need to turn away from the sun, that need to give expression to the god, is going to project itself in an Apollonian image on stage.
Right.
And Nietzsche talks about a particular Apollonian image happening before all others in the evolution of Greek tragedy.
What was that?
So we've got the Greek chorus, and then he's going to talk about how the god Dionysus is going to be first personified as the tragic hero, right? Okay. So the tragic hero is going to be the very first personification of the god on stage for these motives that we have discussed.
Right. No, that makes sense because it kind of delves into. When we think of a tragic hero, we think of it's almost kind of like this downward spiral sort of thing, more or less, or that they succumb to some terrible events. And I guess when you look at that and you see that, and then you look away, you kind of stare into the. When you think, I guess when you look at that, you kind of think like, oh, Oedipus, all these different kind of heroes who, I mean, some of them are cursed, like the Oedipal curse, where it's just like, oh well, I guess I'm gonna have to sleep with my mom, or, you know. So it's like these things where it's just like, that's fate. Like, you are screwed. I guess I can't curse, but
no, we're explicit on iTunes because it said anything that would get into the realm of the PG-13, you have to do explicit. And I think we've
fuck, okay.
Well, why didn't we get that explicit?
No, but I mean, at least like when you look at that, okay, like life is really, I mean, like, again, it's mostly not hunky dory. So then I guess using that metaphor, okay, you look at this and it is kind of bleak anyway, but again, we're using this almost dramatic images of a tragic hero, so it's going to be kind of personified and puffed out. So I guess when you see that bright, and then when you look away, I guess that's what you're saying, then you're going to see the dark spots. I guess the inverse of that metaphor is then you're going to see the dark spots of the abyss that, oh my god, like, life isn't really good at, or like life doesn't really have any meaning after all. Like,
well, the thing is like, the thing that I didn't understand when I got to this conception of like the Dionysian discharging on stage is that the thing I first heard, why tragedy? Like, why did it have to be tragic? Why can't it be a comedy? Mm-hmm. Right. Well, so like you stare into the abyss and like, I mean, think about, there are so many comedians that, you know, understand the pointlessness and the emptiness of life, but they make light of it. Why didn't the Greek satyr chorus just make comedy all the time? Mm-hmm. And, you know, we take it for granted that there's going to be this arc of tragedy, but it need not be that way. I mean, it could have just been frivolous and like dancing and acrobatics. Like, why didn't it turn into like a circus all the time? And I think we've got to account for that a little bit. And it seems like, from what I can gain from Nietzsche, is that when the Dionysian, for whatever reasons, discharges into this Apollonian image, it experiences what we as individuals experience for the first time, or what we experience all the time. And specifically, and I've already sort of hinted at it here, it experiences individuation, and that individuation in the tragic hero is going to be, it's going to necessarily feel the constraints of being a singular self, which coming out of this realm of primordial oneness into the single self. He has this metaphor to sort of describe it as that it's going to be necessarily tragic if we think about the tendency between the Apollonian and the Dionysian to be like the Apollonian being like the crests of waves that are crashing in the ocean or whatever. So like the Dionysian sort of swells up, so there's this wave and it sort of goes into the Apollonian or whatever. But because of the necessary trajectory of being individuated, and maybe this speaks to Freud and there being a death wish and everybody wanting to be at a state of rest or whatever, it's like what goes up must come down. Like, so naturally, individuation in this sort of setting, where you have the Dionysian discharge on stage, is ultimately going to lead to this arc where the individual is going to be destroyed and submerged back into the Dionysian. Mm-hmm. Because it just becomes, there's just too much suffering involved in individual wants and pangs and striving and things like that. It just kind of wants to be with that eternal essence again. Mm-hmm. Which
no, so then I'm just thinking, like, with comedy, like, why not? I was saying, why not comedy? Is that maybe, is comedy more so an Apollonian sort of thing, that it is, when you think about it, it is very much about individual. I guess when you think of modern day comedy, it's, you know, you think of the comedians and their stand up, and it's very much autobiographical or whatnot. And then you think of, I don't know, comedies even in talking about plays or anything like that, how it's very much based on the character and certain situations that those characters get into. Some of it's not necessarily universal, you know, like I don't really go through what Buster Keaton goes through like every day, you know, but I don't know. I mean, that's interesting, like, that you brought up the comedy part, because then it's just like, well, why not comedy? But is it just too Apollonian, or is it like not wanting to admit the abyss, even though sometimes
I wonder if comedy can function. I wonder if comedy can come to be if the precondition for comedy is going to be the Dionysian. And Nietzsche's doing, he's doing a case study here of tragedy, and maybe I can't remember, but maybe later on he'll get to a discussion of comedy or something like that. I know where I am right now with the text. I know he sort of talks about how Euripides sort of bastardizes Greek tragedy, and maybe we'll talk about that. We're at a half hour mark, but I want.
But it's interesting though. I mean, at least sorry to keep on this, or at least even in tragedies. I mean, we can think of like Shakespeare or anything like that. Even in these really intense plays, there's also characters that are just darn right goofy. Funny, which is interesting because then it's just okay. I mean, they're supposed to be really tragic, but then we just have these goofy moments.
Well, and this gets I'm glad you brought this up because I didn't fully describe the evolution of Greek tragedy, because I got to the point where I was able to talk about how the Greek chorus came first, then the projection of the Apollonian merger of the tragic hero. But then the later forms of Greek tragedy, Nietzsche says, starts to involve an ensemble, like you said, right? So you're going to have kings and jesters and wenches and queens and people from all walks of life all in the same play. And you're just kind of like, well, where are these Apollonian images coming from? Well, Nietzsche's going to say that there's still going to be discharges of this Dionysian chorus, which is a manifestation of the Dionysian will or whatever. And what an interesting move that he makes is he says the Dionysian is present. It starts off in Greek tragedy where the Dionysian is just present in the tragic hero. But then as Greek tragedy evolves, he's just as present in that entire ensemble, even in the goofy people. He talks about the god becoming dismembered on stage. So, if you can kind of imagine Dionysus having this sort of bodily form and it just being chopped up into a million bits.
It's like Egyptian mythology. At least I think it was like Osiris. I can't remember. It was Osiris, the god. He was just dismembered by, I don't even know if it was brother or some evil guy. He was just totally dismembered, thrown across the world, and then his wife had to go pick up the pieces and kind of form him back together. It's almost like that.
This is what he's saying is what happens with Greek tragedy is that Dionysus
like that,
incarnates, but he incarnates into the entire ensemble, and whoever's on stage at the particular moment is going to be some aspect of the Dionysian sort of represented. But then they're going to coagulate. Then they're all going to feel the pangs of the principle of individuation, despite how much it may be relieving them from that stare into the abyss. They're going to feel the pangs of that individuation, and it's ultimately going to hit this arc where they just end up in the soup of primordial being again. I don't know if this makes sense. The example, I don't watch or listen to a lot of Greek tragedy. I need to watch some and see if this holds true. But the one that came to mind, I remember I watched Hamlet in high school, and they just all kill each other at the end, and it's so damn tragic. But I'm not really. I don't know if Nietzsche would consider what Shakespeare does Greek tragedy. That's actually an interesting. That's a fertile area of research to consider. Could Shakespeare actually write Greek tragedy, or had it been killed by that point? I don't know. But from what I understand, Hamlet is the closest of the Shakespearean tragedies to what was considered Greek tragedy. But whose definitions of Greek tragedy were you using?
And even in those, when we were talking about the comedy, you get Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are these these goofy two guys are just running a ruckus, So again, it's like that. You get that low of Greek tragedy, and then you sort of get the high, or I guess the goofiness of the. I don't even know if the Apollonian is the goofiness. I guess you were talking about semblance and image and just kind of goofing off in this weird world. I don't know, but
it's
it's the high and low. I guess
he doesn't really describe
comedy,
how that all happens. If there's a typical type of lyrical genius that is involved with each sort of discharge of the Dionysian on stage, because presumably it's going to be very different. Like when you have when you're discharging as the jester, it's going to be a very different skill set than if you're discharging as a gloomy Dane or king or something
I think we're touching on a very interesting part of this text, and maybe like other texts too, that are kind of breaking ground on something that hasn't really been discussed, and it leaves you a lot with more questions than answers. And maybe that's, I mean, and again, we're kind of talking like, oh, well, Nietzsche should have talked about this more, or did this more, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah, he says
sometimes it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I mean, I find like that part's okay. It's like we need somebody to kind of scurry around. It's almost like in a room without a light, and you're kind of like scurrying around, and you know, you're trying to look for something, and you find a match, and you're like, oh, here we go, here's a little bit of a match. And somebody's like, well, why don't you use a lamp instead? Come on, why do you have a match? And it's just like, I've been looking around, like, I've been kind of doing this myself, like, which, I mean, I'd be curious to know, like, how he formed all these opinions and got all these texts. But I mean, it's interesting how, at least for this text, it's sort of unique in itself, and that it leaves a lot of questions, and there's not really anything like, oh, well, why don't we go back to the other text that he's pulling from, blah blah blah. It's like, it's basically just source. It's the literature itself, which we can't really necessarily define as blank or blank, because it's just Apollonian image or tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, it's I find it super fascinating. You know, I mean, he is working within a context, and he is drawing from certain sources. He's not totally working within a vacuum, and he is
but at least talking. I mean, trying to articulate Greek tragedy and use that as some kind of roadmap for art and living, I feel is relatively new, or at least I haven't seen anything like that before.
And I think what we can expect to come from here is that, like, you know, it's going to transition. So we talked about this book in regards to it being a psychoanalytic text, because sort of understanding certain drives of the human mind. We talked about it as being an artistic text, an aesthetic text, and we talked about it even having possibly a metaphysical dimension by talking about what exactly this Dionysian will is.
Sure.
But I think what we're going to see, from what I can recall of what's coming down the road, we're going to see how, like, this is going to be sort of it's going to become an ethical text, or a breakdown of sort of where our morality sort of comes from. Because I mean, I think what he's going to be setting the stage for, and probably by the next time we get together next week or whatever, I'll probably have this figured out a little bit more, is that he says that Greek tragedy died too young, that it killed itself. And I don't really understand how art forms kill themselves, but he says in part it's going to be, there was a willing sort of participant. He has, you know, he points the finger at Euripides, and he says that Euripides didn't understand the disorder and the lawlessness of the Greek tragedy. At least it seemed lawless to him. He didn't understand the Apollonian Dionysian tension, and that ultimately Euripides is going to turn it into like a sitcom or something like that, where he's going to take like he's going to put the spectator on the stage, and like it's going to be like Everybody Loves Raymond except Greek tragedy form,
which is probably still better.
Yeah, you know, and then he's gonna, and I haven't gotten to this part yet, but I think he's gonna say that Socrates. I think he's going to say this, that Socrates couldn't get his mind around the lawlessness of Greek tragedy, and had to
round it up and make it, you know, wrap it up in a pretty bow known as logic and reason.
Yeah, and then Socrates and Euripides, I have a feeling he's going to say Socrates and Euripides ushered in the untimely demise of Greek tragedy, and perhaps weakened the Greek spirit, and then made it conquerable by Christianity. Ultimately, and he's and we've talked about this in the first podcast, what his problems with Christianity are. He finds it to be this otherworldly value system that's going to be ultimately suppressing the will and the will to life.
And I guess that we're gonna see, like, kind of like, I mean, it's interesting, at least like talking about this, and like, okay, and then he's gonna find the Socratic is bad, and then he's gonna want to call back, like, well, he wants to call back the tragic. So it's almost like it's like a revival, like he just wants a tragic revival, essentially. It seems like, to me at least, it's very much a revival sort of.
It may be impossible,
or maybe it's just a reform then, or just kind of reformation, like, you know, I mean, he's carrying in line with the Germans, right? You know, it's like, okay, Martin Luther did it, I'm going to do it for art and philosophy. Like, I'm going to just kind of state my case and like indict these sort of things, like, this is bad, we shouldn't be going this way. That's at least to me what the text sounds like, where he's just like, this is the history of what has happened. this isn't really good, what we're getting to, and we should look back and see what went right, and it went right here, blah blah.
Well, yeah, and I'm a little bit removed from the Nietzsche corpus in general, but I mean, maybe Nietzsche is going to draw, and it's just postulating because I don't know, and we'd have to do a whole other thing on all the other Nietzsche texts and things like that. But maybe Nietzsche is going to drive a lot of the animating force for the Übermensch by studying what he found to be so great about the Greeks. But that is purely hypothesis right now, and he wrote this at 28, and what he writes in his 30s and early 40s.
Yeah, that's
really
another
different.
Interesting thing too, is that we're dealing with young Nietzsche. Because it's like, I mean, granted, most of this he does use later, but in a totally different context, a totally different style. At least from what I've read of him, and then reading this.
I wish I could put these lectures together fast enough so we can figure this out.
Oh no, it's okay. No, it's fine. But I mean, I think that's the interesting thing with philosophy and doing this stuff, is that it sometimes does leave more questions than answers. And that you're almost just kind of looking for more questions. You're not really looking for more answers. That's what I feel like sometimes when I'm looking at this stuff.
I do like answers. I do like
right, but sometimes it's just like if you get the answer, you feel like you're done. And then you're just like, well, I need more questions.
And then what would we live for?
Exactly, right? So it's almost like we're just searching for questions, more questions. And this text
I think that's I think this is going to feed well into why Socratism and scientism took over. And maybe he'll have a critique of this endless search of questions and whether or not it's good for the human spirit or not. So, man, 41 minutes. I'd say that's a good episode right there. I think we covered everything I can cover. All right. Thanks, TJ.